everybody, and welcome to today's video. I wanted to do a talk about game archiving today and preserving the art of video games. With Sony's announcement last week that it was killing off the stores for the PlayStation 3, PSP and Vita, meaning that hundreds, if not thousands of games would become completely inaccessible to people who hadn't already bought them, there has been a big discussion around this, and I wanted to lend my own 2 cents via this video because it is an important topic for the industry and video games as a medium. Now, the PlayStation 3 in particular was the first console where digital distribution really dominated, and the woefully inadequate efforts by Sony to preserve those games that are on it is concerning. So the question then becomes, what can be done about it, both from an industry perspective and as from us as consumers? In the weeks since, I have seen a lot of people default to the buy physical games argument as a response and a way of preserving their games. The problem is that that doesn't work at a personal level, let alone at the level of archiving the entire art form. Physical games are great, don't get me wrong, we all love to own copies of the games that we play, but they're not a forever thing. If you're as old as me, then you know full well that physical media has a lifespan. I have very vivid memories of desperately trying to give my old copy of Tetris on the Game Boy a breath of life so that I could play it one more time. As a kid, I didn't know that breathing into the cartridge resulted in the game degrading more quickly, of course. All I knew was that when I blew into the cartridge, sometimes it would actually work again. In fact, I remember one time holding the game outside of the car window while we were driving down the highway, assuming that the wind that was coming in at 120 kilometers per hour was going to be even more effective at the miracle cure to the Game Boy dead cartridges than my breath. Eventually, however, even that stopped working and the Tetris cartridge refused to work at all. So that just proves that physical games do have a lifespan. Again, physical media dies. Those discs that you're carefully collecting are going to stop working one day. It might not be in the near term, but at some point they are going to stop working. If they don't just die from the passage of time, then any number of things could happen to them. The house might burn down, your pet might use one as a toy, you might be burgled, or simply you may lose a disc when moving. And if your games don't die or disappear, then the hardware that you play them on will absolutely do so as well. The consoles that read discs eventually have lasers that go out. Chips fail, screens crack. At some point these things become very difficult to repair because components become limited. Technology is not invulnerable, and as technology becomes more complex, more things can and do go wrong with it, so it becomes harder and harder to use these devices for the sake of preservation when they themselves are very fragile in a lot of cases and certainly have a time limit associated with them. Owning physical hardware and copies of games feels good, but it's no guarantee that you're going to have permanent access to that game. Even if you were incredibly wealthy and able to buy 2 copies of every game that you owned and every piece of hardware that you played them on, you are still running with only one level of redundancy. And if you've ever spent time in the world of corporates, where data is very valuable, you would know that it is generally considered bad practice for anything critical to only have one layer of redundancy. Most organizations and corporates have 2 or 3 layers of redundancy beyond the tape-based archives which gather dust in warehouses. So unless you're super wealthy and can afford 5 or 6 copies of all these things, you're not going to have an adequate level of redundancy by buying physical media. And all of this is just considering you personally. It also doesn't scale. You may be able to share your games with your immediate friends, but proper archiving and preservation means that everybody that wants to experience a work of art has the ability to do so. You are not helping the preservation and archiving of games by keeping personal copies of games. No, the solution to properly archiving and preserving games needs to be digital and redundant, and unfortunately for us, it really needs the buy-in of the industry and the copyright holders to work across the entire industry. When I think about what I would like to see the games industry do, and I will emphasize up front that I don't believe that they'll do this because of the commercial considerations, what I would like to see is the games industry crib ideas from the Great Library of Alexandria. The Great Library was one of the pinnacles of ancient achievement, and it was so because the library had a mandate to collect and preserve as much as possible. At its height, it was said to have over 100 dedicated archivists working there, and it wasn't simply about them storing the books or the scrolls as was the case back then. They were scrolls, not books. But it was also about making copies of them, securing them, and ensuring their availability for generations to come. Archival is not about just storing stuff, it's about making sure it is available, accessible, and it is going to remain so into perpetuity. So to apply to the video game industry, the best solution, if the industry actually believed that games were works of art and should be preserved, which again I don't believe they think that, but the best solution would be for the major players like Nintendo, Sony, Microsoft, Activision, Ubisoft, Square Enix and so on, to come together to set up a joint venture archival project. They would hire a few dozen archivists full-time, and they would provide the additional money and funds they need to secure licenses or whatever else they need to get the game into the archive. The project's job would be to make sure that the games that are archived could be played on current hardware, so not old hardware, not legacy, and they would ideally want to make those games available on request. I don't necessarily believe that it needs to be free copies for everyone, but limited time loans, such as with actual libraries, would be a good solution. And in fact, in the near term, I wouldn't even necessarily mind if the archive wasn't available to the public at all, if it was a closed archive, at least at the start, because right now the goal should be just to preserve the games. That should be priority number one, because we're about to lose a lot of them, and while they still work out the commercial considerations and so on, this hypothetical archive, if it just stored and preserved them, it would be a big relief to know that those games were at least protected. All of that is not going to happen, of course, because the video game industry remains entirely capitalistic and is not interested in video games as an art form whatsoever. So with that in mind, what can we do? In the first instance, we should preserve digital copies of as much as possible and make as many copies as possible. You should buy a half dozen retro emulation consoles if you can, and put a lot of 128GB SD cards into them with as much of the game libraries that the consoles can play onto those cards. If you are concerned with the ethics of this, just remind yourself that for the overwhelming majority of games, the publishers and developers are more than willing to let them just be wiped clean from history rather than them be accessible, and that is the unethical position here. Buy the games if they're available, of course, but the reality is most of them aren't and most of them never will be, so preserving them this way is really the only thing that you can do to help to make sure that that game remains in the world. And besides, you can always buy these games if they get a legitimate re-release. I was not going to allow the Final Fantasy Legends series on the Game Boy disappear, for example. I was always going to insist on being able to play that, so I did go and get digital copies of those games. As soon as Square Enix released the collection on the Nintendo Switch, I grabbed it as well, and that is how I now play those games. But for another example on the Game Boy, we are never going to see the Snow Brothers, which is my favourite Bubble Bobble-like game, get a re-release. The developer and the publisher of that game are long gone. So do I feel guilty on any level playing that on my Ambernick handheld? No, I don't. I've got so many digital copies of that game, I'm a one-man preservation effort for it alone. Jokes aside, the games industry is intolerably woeful at games preservation. And it's at the point now where it is actually insulting for anybody who cares about the video game industry as an art form, like me, to see what is going on with this industry and just how many thousands of games we are at risk of losing. Given the industry has no respect for this stuff that it is creating, it is on us to make sure that millions of hours of creative work, energy and ideas aren't lost within a generation. We need to do whatever we can to preserve this stuff because the people running the industry do not care, not one whit, and it's on us. Anyhow, thank you very much for watching this video. As always, I hope it was interesting. Do let me know your own thoughts in the comments below, and let's have a talk about preserving video games and what we can and should be doing to do our part for that. Thanks as always for watching again. If you do like my videos, please do click that like and subscribe button. That way you won't miss any as I do them. And also, please consider backing me on Patreon. You can do so for $1 a month or more if you're feeling generous. And that support will help me to continue to grow what I'm doing with this channel and digitally downloaded in general. Finally, if you're into merchandise at all, we have a shop which has over 150, I believe, items right now, ranging from mugs to bed sheets and from coasters to bath mats. We've got it all, really. And there's a link below in the description. You can get all of that stuff. It all has DD, the DDNet mascot, so it's all very cute and pretty. And yeah, once again, by investing in that stuff, then you're also supporting what we do at DDNet. Thanks as always. We will see you at the next video.